In this tutorial, we're going to start to explore really the relationship and the association between how the pelvis can move in the goal swing, both from a positional observation and also an orientation or rotational one, and how it then can connect back to then the path the club is delivered on and moved on through impact. So in some ways, very much the approach of the kind of pelvis's path. So how the pelvis moves in many ways has a significant, a very dominant influence on then the path the club has moved on through impact. So yes, we have to acknowledge there are multiple influences around how the path is produced through hand and wrist, through the rib cage, through lower limbs, through foot and ankle, through ground reaction force, through the club kinetics. So we accept and acknowledge there's so many areas which we have to certainly acknowledge and appreciate as to kind of why the path is produced the way it is. But certainly when we look at movement correlations, or to be very precise, movement associations, one of the more dominant connections we can make, certainly when we look at the actual kinematics, those segment movements, is the position and the orientation of the pelvis in swing has a significant, a very dominant influence then on the path being produced, hence that approach that in many ways pelvis is path. So we're going to really walk through three examples of someone that produces a very almost inside path in very kind of informal definition. So the path very much moving to the right for this particular player, as a right-handed player, through impact. Then someone that produces that kind of very outside path, once again, in that very colloquial definition. And again, then what kind of pelvis movements and pelvis associations can we start to then connect to that particular type of path profile? And then someone that delivers the club on somewhat close to a kind of a 0-1 degree path, so somewhat kind of much more for almost a very informal definition, neutral path into impact. And then once again, what pelvis association can we see? So very much looking at kind of almost the scale in some ways, when a path is very much to the left or outside, depending on which reference system and definition one wishes to use, is what pelvis connections, what movement associations can we then start to see and establish as far as how the pelvis moves, both from a positional and rotational observation, equally and so for the path that is in essence too much in the inside, for example, and then someone that produces a path somewhat closer to that kind of 0-1 degree approach. So as you'll see here on screen, we have two windows on the right hand side as shown by the arrows on screen. The top window is the orientation, the three-dimensional rotation of the pelvis in swing. And the real plot of interest for this tutorial is the blue plot, which is the rotation, in essence, the pure rotation of that pelvis as it rotates in movement swing. And then as shown by the arrow beneath, we then have the position of the pelvis. And again, the real plots of interest for this tutorial will be the blue plot, which is the lateral sway, the movement along that frontal plane, the sway value in many ways of the pelvis. And then equally so, then we have the green plot, which is the forwards and backward thrust, so the movement towards, the movement away of that pelvis in. And then also we have here, as you'll see in the movable window, we have the real-time path number. So through the ball 3D system, we can actually track path as a real-time number through the entire swing. So rather than say, just through launch monitor, for example, having that kind of point data, at that point in time, we have a value of X, for example. Through the ball 3D system, we're actually able to track the path through the entire goal swing. So really understanding actually how that path has been produced through swing can be a much more revealing way of almost understanding the story of how they produce that particular value in and around impact. So just to speed up the sequence of events, let's take the player to this position in time here. So you can actually start to see now that as we start to move the player downwards, we have a club path angle being produced, you see in the real-time values. And we also have a very, very defined profile of how this person is moving their pelvis, both in that positional and orientation sense, as they move it into impact. So as we get to the impact position, which is defined by the yellow line on screen, we have a path in essence of 0.44 degrees outside or left, again, really depend on what reference one wishes to use. But we can really start to establish some very, very defined pelvis movements then in many ways connect back to and certainly influence then why this particular path is able to be produced. So as shown by the arrow on the screen, we have the real-time value of just under 36 degrees of rotation of that pelvis as the player moves into the back. So certainly a very significantly rotated pelvis as they move into impact. And equally so, once again, as shown by the arrow on the screen, we have a pelvis sway value. So a lateral move in that pelvis of just under 15 centimeters towards the target relative to its start position at point of impact. But certainly a very significant interest, certainly when we start to map through and walk through the other two examples tutorial, we have the pelvis thrust value once again as shown by the arrow on screen, of a minus 1.03 centimeters, in essence, away from the target. So really how that pelvis has moved in downswing, how it's glided towards the target, it's significantly rotated and has actually moved away from the target relative to its start position. So we can start to see these kind of pelvis positions that with evident lateral shift, with very high amounts of rotation, with that pelvis starting to move backwards, the path this person then produce is much closer to that kind of zero value, again, assuming that's the aspiration and the intent of that player. So the values produced as far as the rotation, the lateral sway and the thrust are almost somewhat towards almost these normative references, almost sometimes the expected value. So it really depends on then who expects the value and often where's that expectation really come from. But looking at kind of normative values, the literature, threads that kind of run through many of the more established movers, these values are somewhat close to often the aspiration of many players as far as the lateral shift, just under 15 centimeters, the rotation just over 35 degrees, and the thrust value, a negative value. The pelvis has actually moved further away from the ball relative to its start position at impact. So somewhat close to almost the expected normative value, certainly many people certainly achieve and aspire in swing. So let's now look at the play it produces a very dominant path that moves left or an outside path. Again, very much depending on the reference system one wishes to use it. So once again, just to really speed up the sequence of events, let's now move this play into impact. You now start to see, as we go to the impact position just here, as defined by the yellow line on, or the eye reference, the vertical eye sign, as shown on the plots. We have a very different pelvis profile compared to the previous example. As far as initially, let's look at the rotation of the pelvis, just under 45 degrees, so 10 degrees more rotated in that pelvis at impact relative to the person it produces almost that kind of zero path as it would be as you move into impact. We then look at the sway value as shown by the arrow on screen in the blue plot beneath, only 6.82 centimeters, so almost 8 centimeters less lateral movement of that pelvis along that frontal plane towards the target. So in essence, more rotation, less lateral shift in that pelvis at impact relative to its start position. And again, as shown by the arrow on the screen, the pelvis thrust value is actually a positive value. It's only 0.26, but it's still moving somewhat towards the ball as the player moves into impact. So very different pelvis movement, both positional and rotational profile. More rotation, less shift, slightly more movement towards the ball, but again only really 0.3 if we kind of round up, so very small amounts of thrust. So we can now start to see these threads, these profiles that start to kind of appear and almost establish that more lateral shift, somewhat almost the middle ground of rotation, but then evident amounts of movement away from the ball with that pelvis thruster impact. In this particular case, produces somewhere close to a zero path. However, when compared to someone that rotates more, shifts less, doesn't really thrust back, doesn't really thrust forwards, a very dominant outside path, as you see here, is shown by the movable pop-up window on screen of 6.14 degrees left or to the outside. So we can start to see these profiles appear now. How the pelvis moves both as far as the lateral shift, the amounts of rotation, the forward and backward thrust, can then very much then connect back to the club delivery into, in this case, very much the path as it moves into impact. And then the final example we can look at in this tutorial, again, just to really speed up those sequence of events, we can now move this particular play into impact. So once again, as we go into the impact position just here, we have a very dominant inside path. So once again, as shown by the movable window on screen, we have a path value of 3.36 degrees from the inside. So a very different type of path, in essence 9 degrees further right compared to the previous example, who was 6 degrees left. So almost a tolerance, a scale of 9 degree difference from the 6 degrees left to the 3 degrees right as it would be in very informal angle. So a path over 3 degrees from the inside. But once again, we can then start to establish very different pelvis position, pelvis orientations that very much connect back to, once again, why the path is being delivered that way into impact. So it's shown by the arrow on the screen. As far as the rotation of the pelvis, only 24 degrees of rotation, so somewhat almost half the rotation is shown in the previous example, who produced a path very evidently left of over 6 degrees, and have a very under-rotated pelvis. And certainly of note, these three players are all current players on the PGA Tour. So very, very established, very advanced players. So to say that kind of one approach is actually better than the other, well, that's really kind of simply not true, because these are all three very, very established players, all hitting 6 irons, all in that kind of range environment. So as far as the task demands, the environment this data was captured in, very, very comparable. They're just trying to hit what they would see as almost that kind of range 6 iron, if there's ever such a thing within practice. So certainly as far as the test samples used and the environment capture within, very, very comparable. So what we look at this play though, to make it about the association of the pelvis movement alongside the path being produced, a much less rotated pelvis produces a much more inside path as you move it into impact. And equally, again, looking at the values beneath and the plot underneath, as far as the position is shown by the arrow on screen, we now have a pelvis sway value of 14 centimeters. So actually the same as the first example, so 8 centimeters more than the example shown previous with the outside path. So that evident shift in the pelvis, so a very clear glide in lateral move of that pelvis left in downswing, but this time compared to the first example of 35 degrees of rotation, we now have an example of 25 degrees of rotation. So ironically 10 degrees less than the first one, but actually then 20 degrees less than the previous one. So almost these kind of scales of 10 degrees, 10 degrees, 10 degrees in rotational differences. And then is shown by the arrow on screen once more. We then have a pelvis thrust value of 1.32 centimeters back, so clearly back even further from that ball relative to its start position. So you then start to see less rotation, more shift, slight movement back. Then in this example, we start to then connect back to a path that clearly moves right. So in essence, more shift, less rotation, the path then starts to get pushed and move right. We can also look at it from a much more kind of dynamical systems observation and a much more kind of task-based approach. One could then argue that how the club moves into the ball could also then be responsible for the position and orientation of the pelvis. We can actually look at it both ways. Is it the way the club moves into impact, which is then almost encouraging and almost allowing the player to self-organise in some ways to allow that pelvis to then be positioned and rotated in the way it is? Or is it simply because the way the pelvis is moved, that proximal segment? So we look then more from almost the deterministic biomechanics, the idea of proximal distal sequencing or summation of speed, or is it more informally almost the kinematic sequence, when we look at that proximal segment being the first one to really move in transition, reach its peak angular velocity in downswing. We can look at it both ways. Is it that sequential movement of pelvis, thorax, arms, hands, club, which then allowed the more distal segment of the club to move the way it does? So we can look at it that way from a very kind of extrinsic, much more deterministic biomechanical observation. When we look at the kinematic sequence, the proximal distal sequencing philosophy, is it where the pelvis moves because it's the first segment to both move in transition and also reach its peak speed, which is then certainly responsible for and influential on why the club moves that way? Or more from a task approach, almost the very opposite end of that scale, is it the way the players organised, almost that self-organised organic system that we are as human beings, which has then allowed the club to move that way, which is then responsible for why the pelvis is then positioned and rotated away? So we have to kind of look at it both ways. But what we can see when we look at these three examples, the very kind of neutral path, evident shifts in the pelvis, somewhat to the middle amounts of rotation, the pelvis moving slightly away from the ball. When we then look at the very clear outside path, less shift, slight movement towards the ball, much more rotation. Then we look at the more inside path, very minimal amounts of rotation, lots of lateral shift, the pelvis then moving slightly away from the ball. So we can then start to really see in some ways that to understand path, we have to understand pelvis, because when we look at the movement correlations, those kinematic associations, in many ways pelvis is simply path. And then finally, using some of the animations within the ball 3D system, we can actually then start to look at almost the position of the pelvis and impact relative to its address position. So from the cloud view, the above view, looking at the pelvis independently, the grey pelvis is the pelvis position at address, and then the red pelvis is the pelvis position and orientation and impact. So you see here with the path being 1.39 out, so that kind of very close to kind of zero path, almost the neutral path, again using that very informal definition. We can see how the red pelvis is almost on top of the left hip. If we look at it very informally, shown by the arrow, which really kind of defines clearly that left hip at address, how the origin, the middle of the pelvis is almost covering that left hip as it would be impact relative to its start position. If we look at the rotation of the pelvis, the position of the pelvis in some ways is almost over that left hip from a position and orientation observation at impact relative to its start position. Whereas when we look at the outside path, once again is shown by the value on screen of 5.32 degrees to the outside. We can clearly see once again, as shown by the arrow on screen, how that left side of the pelvis through that kind of ilium into that kind of left hip is clearly visible at impact, as shown by the grey part of the pelvis, compared to the red pelvis being the impact position of the pelvis. So very different pelvis profile. On the previous one, that left side of the pelvis and somewhat was covered because the pelvis is glided laterally left. But in this case, when there's less shift, more rotation, in some ways that left side of that iliac crest into the ilium into that left hip, in a very informal definition, once again is shown by the arrow on screen, is clearly visible relative to that pelvis position at impact. And then finally, looking at the inside path, once again is shown by the value on screen of 3.32 degrees on the inside, how the pelvis is actually outside of and certainly much less rotated at impact relative to that kind of left side of the pelvis, once again as shown by the arrow on screen. So these three different kind of pelvis profile positions, very much shown through the visual animations. When the pelvis is kind of glided left and rotated, in some ways it kind of covers the left hip as it would be seen and viewed in this visual representation. With the outside path, how the left side of the pelvis is visible, it's more rotated, and in essence kind of almost backed up, not that it is, but certainly using the visual representations shown by these images. And then on the inside path is the one currently still displayed on screen, how the pelvis is a long way left of the left hip in essence at impact relative to start position, and still very kind of almost, not that it is of course because it was 24 degrees rotated, but it certainly visibly looks like it's almost parallel line. There's lack of rotation through that pelvis in that visual image relative to its impact and address position. So really what can we learn and extract from the tutorial? In many ways, how the club moves, so the path of the club absolutely influences the path, and also from those movement associations, how the pelvis moves clearly then connects back to the club path being produced. In some ways, path is pelvis, pelvis is path. So there's a movement association when looking to how we move as the human and how it connects back to how the club moves. To really understand path, we have to understand the pelvis, and equally so then, to best understand the pelvis, we also then really have to understand the path the club moved on.